please welcome Dr. Tyrone Holmes.
Unconscious bias is a powerful yet quiet performance killer. It literally makes us do things we didn't mean to do, say things we didn't mean to say, and sometimes even offend people without understanding how we offended them. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, by definition, unconscious bias refers to our biases, of course, our stereotypes, our prejudices, our attitudes that affect both our thinking and our behavior, but in ways that we don't realize. It affects our thinking and behavior in ways that are invisible to us and doesn't allow us to necessarily make any corrections to that behavior before it creates problems. Now, there are many different types of unconscious bias, but I only want to focus on two, and I want to focus on these two because they have the potential to have a significantly negative impact on the recruitment and selection process. And I'm talking about any recruitment and selection process. It could be the recruitment and selection of speakers for events. It could be the recruitment and selection of employees for an organization. It could be the recruitment and selection of individuals that you'd like to be a part of your association. Anytime that we are actually going after people, making some evaluations relative to those people, and seeing if they'll be a good fit for our organization, there's two types of unconscious bias that can have a negative impact on that process without us even realizing it. The first is what we call affinity bias. And affinity bias is based on a very simple concept and a very interesting one, and that is, as human beings, we have a natural tendency to gravitate toward those we perceive to be most like ourselves, and therefore away from those we perceive to be less like ourselves. Put another way, we like to hang out with people who look like us, walk like us, talk like us, think like us, and act like us. It really is that simple. And the reality is we do it for a very simple reason, and that is we want to find relative comfort. There's comfort in likeness, there's comfort in familiarity, and we seek comfort in our day-to-day interactions. I'm going to give you a very simple example. Think about what most people did when you came to this event. You probably rode around the block a few times figuring out how to park. Once you figured that out, you went down into that garage, you came upstairs and tried to figure out where this event was. Once you figured out you had to keep coming up the stairs, you came in, you went to registration, and then when you came in here, what's the first thing most people did, and particularly those who were alone? You looked for people you knew. You tried to find some familiarity, and the reason is that there is comfort in familiarity. The way I like to say this is that familiarity breeds comfort. It also breeds contempt, but that's a different presentation. We're going to focus on the comfort piece, but it breeds comfort. And so that's one of the issues that is potentially a problem when it comes to affinity bias, because we seek comfort, we seek likeness, and I want to be real clear about this. Fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with that, but the potential problem is if we do that relative to the recruitment and selection process without realizing it, guess who we go after? Guess who we try to recruit? And guess who we ultimately bring into our organizations or bring in as speakers? People who look like us, walk like us, talk like us, think like us, and act like us. So that's one potential problem. Another type of unconscious bias that can be problematic is what we call beauty bias. And beauty bias is based on the idea that we have a tendency during these recruitment and selection processes to go after people who are quote unquote relatively attractive. And I'm going to give you three examples. We call these the 3 A's of this attractiveness. And the first A is probably not one you're going to be surprised with. And let me point out that when I talk about these 3 A's, I'm talking about these tend to be the characteristics of people that we hire, the characteristics of people we bring into organizations. And they tend to have these 3 A's. The first A is not a surprise, is attractive. The second A is probably not going to be a surprise either. It's articulate. And particularly if you're trying to hire a speaker, that's probably a good idea. You probably want to bring somebody who's articulate, who's erudite, who can put some words together and do so in ways that could be uplifting and inspiring to people. So that makes a lot of sense. But the third A, I bet, is going to be a surprise to you. Anybody know what the third A is? Above average height. Yes, above average height. Now, we do not have the time to do a deep drill on this concept. But if you're interested, check out some of the work that Malcolm Gladwell has done, his book, Blink, and some of his subsequent work. But I want to give you 2 examples of this whole notion that looking at height is an unconscious bias that has manifested itself significantly in our recruitment and selection processes. The first is as follows. In the US, less than 15% of males are over 6 feet tall. However, nearly 60% of US Fortune 500 CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Likewise, less than 4% of US males are over 6 feet 2 inches tall, yet nearly 30% of US Fortune 500 CEOs are over 6 feet 2 inches tall. Now here's the thing that's interesting about this, and I think I can say this with absolute assuredness and absolute confidence, and I want to emphasize this because I think this is a good example of how the unconscious bias process can manifest itself in the things that we do. I am very confident about the following. I do not believe that anywhere in America is there a person or a group of people who are responsible for a recruitment assessment process, getting the staff of people who are going to facilitate that process together, going into a room, dimming the lights, huddling up close, and in a hushed tone saying the following: let's go hire some tall people. I don't think anybody is doing that, yet we see this dynamic where a lot of times, and for a lot of different positions, we're hiring a disproportionate number of people who are tall. So that's what unconscious bias is and the potential problems with it. What I want to do is give you a couple of tips and techniques that you can utilize to minimize the extent to which unconscious bias impacts your decision-making process and minimize the extent to which it might lead you to recruit and select some inappropriate or ineffective people for your organization. The first thing I want to focus on, and I want to emphasize this, and I want to say this from the bottom of my heart, that a big part of this process, and I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I've worked with literally thousands of people, and one of the things that I always emphasize is that if you want to be effective at reducing your biases and ultimately building powerful connections, building powerful relationships, and doing that in ways that can be uplifting and inspiring to all those involved, one of the things we have to do is we have to be honest with ourselves. And we have to ask ourselves, what are our biases, our prejudices, and our stereotypes? And the reality is, everyone in this room, everyone outside of this room has biases, has preferences, has prejudices, and has stereotypes. We all do. It doesn't make us bad people, but it has the potential to make us less effective than we want to be if we don't focus on what some of those are. So the first thing I'm going to suggest is think about what are some of your biases and prejudices. And of course, this is personal. This is not something you want to share on Facebook or Twitter or all those kinds of things. This is personal and it's all for you. But think about what some of those are. And a question you can ask yourself very simply, and we'll go back to the comfort issue, is ask yourself, what are the situations and circumstances in which I'm comfortable? And the other side of that coin, what are the situations and circumstances in which I'm less comfortable? And if there's a circumstance or situation in which you're less comfortable, and you look at that and you see, okay, who's involved in that? Who are the people I'm around? What am I doing in that particular situation or circumstance? That might give you an indication of what some of your biases or some of your preferences are. So that's the first step. The second thing that you can do is you can start to interact in circumstances and situations in which you're less comfortable. And I'm going to give you a real simple, quick example. I'm going to talk about baby boomers and millennials, because I do a fair amount of conversation around age differences and the impact they can have on us. And I'm not going to suggest that all baby boomers want to hang out together and all millennials want to hang out together, but let's just say, for example, a person's a baby boomer and they like hanging out with other baby boomers. That's their comfort zone. That's what gives them some situation and circumstance in which they feel good and they can interact more effectively. And let's just say that they recognize that they have less of an effectiveness in interacting with millennials. What I can suggest is one of the things that we can do is start to interact outside of our comfort zone. So if you're a baby boomer who's less comfortable with millennials, one thing you can do is interact a little bit more with millennials. And I'm not saying you need to go to the 2018 Millennial Convention and hang out with millennials. I'm not saying that. I'm saying maybe you take a millennial to lunch. Or maybe you interact with somebody that you typically don't interact with, because one of the things that can do is it can begin to reduce some of those biases and increase the size of your comfort zone, so to speak. And then the last thing I'm going to suggest is this whole notion, and some of you may be familiar with this, there's a concept that we call decategorization, and it's born out of the idea that we can reduce our biases and we can become more effective interacting with a more diverse group of people through this process of decategorization. And how you decategorize is with this thing we call self-talk. And it's a real simple process. And I'll use the example of the baby boomer and the millennial. And let's just say the baby boomer said, okay, I'm going to go out to lunch with this millennial, and I'm sure that person's going to have all their technology and all that kind of stuff because they're a millennial, but I want to get to know this person. I want to try to erase my preconceived notions about them and really get comfortable and getting to know them a little bit better. One of the things that you can do, and this is a form of cognitive restructuring, so it actually works, is that you can say to yourself before you actually have that interaction, you can say, what I'm going to do when I interact with this person, when we connect and we go over to the place we're going to have to eat lunch, what I'm going to do is I am going to spend a few minutes listening to them. I'm not going to utilize any of my preconceived notions to judge them. I'm not going to make any assumptions about them or what they do. I'm going to genuinely and sincerely try to do everything I can to get to know this person. And that sounds simple, but the reality is that that's not always easy for us to do. But what makes it easier is this process of self-talk, where we actually say to ourselves before we engage in that interaction that we're going to go in there and go with an empty slate and try to get to know that person as best as possible. With that in mind, I want to simply close with the idea that if you apply some of these tools and some of these techniques, you can significantly reduce your unconscious bias. You can improve your ability to actually have effective recruitment and selection processes. And you can increase the likelihood that you'll go out and you'll hire some short people. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the program.